You think you know yourself pretty well, don't you? That you're a good person who makes rational decisions? Carl Jung, one of history's greatest psychologists, would disagree. He discovered something shocking. The better person you think you are, the more your mind is probably lying to you. Welcome to the world of shadow theory, where everything you think you know about yourself might be wrong. In 1913, Jung experienced what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. It started after a huge fight with his mentor, Sigmund Freud. Jung had been Freud's favorite student, the one everyone thought would carry on his legacy. But Jung saw something his teacher didn't want to see, that the human mind was far more complex than just suppressed desires and childhood trauma. This disagreement didn't just end their friendship, it sent Jung into a psychological crisis that would change psychology forever. For 6 years, Jung did something most people would consider crazy. Every night, he would sit in his study and deliberately make himself face his darkest thoughts and scariest impulses. He filled notebooks with strange drawings and wrote down his wildest dreams. His family worried he was losing his mind. But Jung wasn't crazy. He was onto something huge. He realized that all the parts of ourselves we try to hide don't just disappear. They grow stronger in the dark like mushrooms. Think about it like this. Have you ever met someone who constantly talks about how honest they are? Jung noticed something fascinating. These people often turned out to be the biggest liars. Not because they were trying to deceive others, but because they were deceiving themselves. The more they pushed away the possibility that they could be dishonest, the more that dishonesty grew in their blind spot. Jung called this our shadow, not just our dark side, but everything about ourselves that we refuse to see. It's like having a second personality that contains everything we think we're not. The church leader who preaches against greed while secretly embezzling money isn't just a hypocrite. They're someone whose shadow has taken control because they refuse to admit they could be tempted. But here's where it gets really interesting. Jung discovered that the shadow isn't just about obvious bad things like greed or dishonesty. Sometimes our shadow contains positive things we're afraid to admit about ourselves. Maybe you're smarter than you let yourself believe, but admitting that would mean taking on more responsibility. Or maybe you're more creative than you allow yourself to be, but showing that might mean standing out from the crowd. The really tricky part? The better person you try to be, the stronger your shadow becomes. Jung found this out the hard way during his own crisis. He had spent years building up an image as the perfect doctor, the perfect husband, the perfect student of Freud. When that image cracked, all the things he'd been denying came flooding out. But instead of destroying him, this flood became his greatest discovery. Take the story of one of Jung's patients, a priest who came to him with terrible depression. This priest spent his whole life helping others, never asking for anything in return. He seemed like the perfect example of a good person. But in therapy, Jung discovered something surprising. The priest's depression came from denying his own needs for so long. By trying to be perfectly selfless, he'd created a shadow full of suppressed anger and unmet desires. The cure wasn't to become selfish, but to acknowledge that having needs didn't make him a bad person. Or consider another case, a businessman who prided himself on being totally rational and in control. He came to Jung because of recurring nightmares about being chased by wild animals. Through their work together, Jung helped him see that these animals represented his suppressed emotional side. The more he denied having feelings, the more savage those feelings became in his dreams. Once he started acknowledging his emotions, not only did the nightmares stop, but he became a better leader because he could finally understand what motivated his employees. This is why Jung said our shadow isn't actually our enemy. It's more like a misunderstood friend trying to get our attention. Think of it like a pressure valve. The more you try to be perfect, the more pressure builds up in your shadow. Eventually, that pressure has to go somewhere. That's why the strictest parents often have the most rebellious kids, and why people who never allow themselves to get angry often end up exploding over tiny things. Jung found that this pattern shows up everywhere, not just in individuals but in whole societies. When a culture tries to be perfectly orderly and rational, its shadow emerges in wild subcultures and movements. When a society refuses to acknowledge its capacity for violence, that violence often explodes in unexpected ways. This is why Jung believed that understanding our shadow isn't just personal growth. It's crucial for human survival. But here's the amazing part. Once you start acknowledging your shadow, something incredible happens. All that energy you spent denying parts of yourself becomes available for actually living your life. It's like trying to hold a beach ball underwater. It takes constant effort, and eventually, it's going to pop up anyway. But if you let it float naturally, you can use that energy for swimming instead. Jung wrote about a woman who spent her whole life being nice, never getting angry, never saying no, always putting others first. When she finally allowed herself to acknowledge her anger, she didn't become a mean person. Instead, she became truly kind because she could choose to be nice, rather than being nice out of fear. Her relationships improved because they were based on honesty rather than suppression. This is the first key to understanding how your mind might be lying to you. The harder you try to be only one thing, like perfectly good, perfectly rational, or perfectly kind, the more your mind has to lie to itself about all the other things you could be. And those lies don't just disappear. They grow stronger in your shadow, waiting for a chance to break free. In the next part, we'll explore exactly how to spot these lies and what to do about them. But for now, ask yourself, what parts of yourself have you been pushing away? What would happen if instead of trying to be perfect, you tried to be whole? Here's something that might shock you. That person who drives you absolutely crazy, they're actually showing you a hidden part of yourself. Jung discovered this mind-blowing truth while working with arguing couples. He noticed something strange. People kept falling in love with, then getting furious at. People who had the exact qualities they denied in themselves. Take Sarah, one of Jung's most interesting cases. She came to him complaining about her lazy husband, who never helped around the house. She worked hard, kept everything perfect, and couldn't understand why he wouldn't do the same. But as Jung worked with her, something surprising came out. Every time Sarah tried to relax, she felt overwhelming guilt. She'd pushed away her own need for rest so hard that she could only see it in her husband and hate it there. This is what Jung called projection, and once you understand it, you'll never see your relationships the same way again. Think about that coworker who annoys you because they're always showing off. Jung would ask, what if they trigger you because you're not letting yourself shine? Or that friend whose neediness drives you crazy? Could it be that you're not admitting your own needs for connection? Jung found this pattern everywhere. A businessman who prided himself on being honest was constantly suspicious that others were lying to him. A woman who thought of herself as kind kept attracting mean friends. A teacher who suppressed all anger kept encountering aggressive students. It wasn't bad luck. Their shadows were showing them what they refused to see in themselves. But here's where it gets really interesting. Jung discovered that projection isn't just about negative things. We also project our good qualities that we're afraid to own. Maybe you admire someone's creativity but tell yourself, I could never do that. Or you're impressed by someone's confidence but think, that's just not me. Jung would say, these aren't just random admirations. They're parts of yourself you haven't claimed yet. One of Jung's most fascinating cases was a young artist who kept falling into hero worship with other artists, then becoming bitterly disappointed when they turned out to be normal people. Through their work together, she realized she was projecting her own artistic genius onto others because she was afraid to own it herself. Once she took back this projection, her art flourished, not because she became more talented, but because she finally allowed herself to access the talent that was always there. This projection mechanism explains something you've probably noticed: why we tend to be hardest on people who remind us of ourselves. Parents often get most frustrated with children who share their own struggles. Teachers might be toughest on students who make their own childhood mistakes. Even friends often fight most with people who mirror their own insecurities. Jung documented the case of a father who was extremely harsh with his son's academic performance. The father had been a struggling student himself but worked hard to become successful. Instead of this creating empathy, it made him even harder on his son. Why? Because seeing his son struggle brought up all the self-judgment he still carried about his own past difficulties. But here's the thing about projections. They're not always completely wrong. Sometimes that annoying coworker really is showing off. Sometimes that friend really is being needy. The key insight Jung offered is this: if something or someone triggers a strong emotional reaction in you, they might be showing you something real, but your intense reaction is coming from your shadow. Think of it like this: Imagine you're watching a movie projected on a wall. The wall might be white, but if you project a colorful image onto it, it appears to have those colors. Our projections work the same way. We take something real in another person and add our own unconscious material to it, making it seem much bigger and more significant than it really is. Jung found this happened a lot with authority figures. A boss might make a minor criticism, but if it hits your shadow, maybe your hidden fears about being incompetent, it feels like a devastating attack. Or a parent might offer gentle advice, but if it touches on something you're denying about yourself, it can trigger intense defensiveness. This is why Jung said that our strongest emotional reactions are actually windows into our shadow. The next time you feel intensely triggered by someone, try asking yourself, what am I not wanting to see in myself? The answer might surprise you. One of Jung's clients, a judge known for giving harsh sentences, realized through this process that he was actually terrified of his own capacity for breaking rules. But here's the hopeful part. Once you start recognizing your projections, they lose their power over you. That annoying coworker becomes less annoying when you realize they're showing you your own suppressed desire for recognition. That needy friend becomes easier to handle when you acknowledge your own needs for connection. And something even more amazing happens. When you take back your projections, you reclaim your power. Instead of seeing your good qualities in others and your bad qualities in enemies, you can start owning all of who you are. This doesn't mean becoming perfect. It means becoming whole. This leads us to the next crucial piece of shadow work: what to do once you've spotted these projections. But before we get there, take a moment to think about your own life. Who triggers strong emotions in you? What qualities in others do you find yourself constantly judging or admiring? These aren't random. They're maps leading straight to your shadow. Now we're getting to the most powerful part of Jung's discovery. What happens when you stop fighting your shadow and start working with it? This isn't just about accepting your dark side. It's about finding hidden gold in the parts of yourself you've been taught to reject. Let's start with something that might sound crazy at first. Jung found that some of our best qualities are often trapped in our shadow. Think about children. They're naturally creative, playful, and honest about their feelings. But as we grow up, we learn to push these qualities away. Stop being silly. Don't make a scene. Keep your feelings to yourself. Over time, these natural traits get buried in our shadow. Jung documented the case of a successful businessman who came to him with a strange problem. He had everything society said he should want: money, status, family, but felt dead inside. Through their work together, they discovered something surprising. All his childhood dreams of being an artist had been pushed into his shadow. He didn't just suppress his desire to make art, he'd suppressed his entire creative side. But here's where it gets interesting. When this man finally started allowing himself to paint, just as a hobby on weekends, something unexpected happened. He didn't just become happier, he became a better businessman. All that creative energy he'd been pushing away turned out to be exactly what he needed to solve complex business problems in new ways. This points to something crucial Jung discovered. Every quality in your shadow has both a destructive and a constructive side. Take anger, for example. Most of us learn to push it away because we think it's bad. But Jung found that suppressed anger doesn't disappear. It turns into passive aggression, depression, or even physical illness. However, when acknowledged and integrated, anger becomes the energy we need to set boundaries, fight injustice, and protect what we care about. One of Jung's most remarkable cases was a woman who prided herself on never getting angry. She was the perfect mother, perfect wife, perfect church member, but she suffered from crippling migraines and couldn't understand why. Through working with Jung, she started acknowledging her anger at her demanding husband, at her ungrateful children, at the church members who took advantage of her kindness. As she learned to express these feelings appropriately, something amazing happened. Her migraines disappeared. The same principle applies to qualities we think of as negative. Take selfishness, for example. We're taught it's bad to be selfish, so we push it into our shadow. But Jung found that people who completely deny their selfish side often end up being manipulative or passive-aggressive about getting their needs met. When they learn to acknowledge their right to take care of themselves, they actually become more genuinely generous because they're choosing to give rather than giving out of guilt. Jung worked with a nurse who was burning out from constantly caring for others. She felt guilty about wanting any time for herself. That would be selfish. But once she acknowledged her right to have needs, she became a better nurse. Why? Because she could finally set healthy boundaries and take care of herself, which gave her more energy for her patients. This leads to one of Jung's most powerful insights. The shadow isn't your enemy. It's more like a misunderstood part of yourself that's trying to help you survive. Even our darkest qualities usually start as protection mechanisms. Arrogance might be protecting us from feeling worthless. Laziness might be our body's way of telling us we're on the wrong path. Jealousy might be pointing us toward what we really want in life. Take the story of Tom, another of Jung's patients. He was ashamed of his jealousy toward more successful colleagues. But when he started working with this jealousy instead of suppressing it, he realized something important. His jealousy was showing him what he really wanted to achieve. Once he acknowledged this, his jealousy transformed into motivation. He didn't become less ambitious. He became more honest about his ambition. This is why Jung said that integrating your shadow doesn't make you a worse person. It makes you a more authentic one. When you stop pretending to be only good, only rational, or only caring, you can start being genuinely good, rational, and caring by choice, rather than by compulsion. One of Jung's most surprising findings was that people who acknowledge their shadow actually become more ethical, not less. Why? Because they're no longer acting from a place of denial. Someone who admits they could be tempted to lie is more likely to be honest than someone who believes they could never lie. Someone who acknowledges their capacity for selfishness is more likely to make genuinely generous choices. Think about it like this. If you're on a diet and you tell yourself you'll never eat chocolate again, what happens? Usually, you end up binge eating chocolate. But if you acknowledge your desire for chocolate and allow yourself to have it sometimes, you can make better choices about when and how much to eat. The same principle applies to our shadow qualities. Acknowledging them gives us choice over how to express them. This integration process isn't easy. Jung compared it to alchemy, the medieval attempt to turn lead into gold. But unlike those ancient alchemists, we're not trying to get rid of the lead, our shadow qualities. Instead, we're learning to see that the lead and gold are two sides of the same coin. Every shadow quality has its golden aspect, if we're willing to work with it rather than against it. This brings us to the practical question. How do we actually do this integration work? How do we turn our shadow qualities from enemies into allies? That's exactly what we'll explore in our next section. But for now, remember, your shadow isn't just a collection of flaws to be fixed. It's a source of hidden treasures waiting to be discovered. Now let's get into the real meat of shadow work. How to actually do it. Jung didn't just want people to understand their shadow. He wanted to give them practical tools to work with it. Think of this like being a detective in your own mind, looking for clues about the parts of yourself you've pushed away. The first tool Jung gave his patients was something he called trigger tracking. It's simple but powerful. Whenever you have a strong emotional reaction to someone or something, write it down. Not just what happened, but how it made you feel in your body. That pit in your stomach when your coworker gets praised, that tension in your jaw when someone breaks a rule. These physical reactions are your shadow trying to get your attention. One of Jung's patients, a college professor, started doing this and noticed something interesting. Every time one of his students asked stupid questions, he felt a burning sensation in his chest and had to resist the urge to humiliate them. When he explored this reaction, he remembered something he'd completely forgotten. How he'd been mocked by his own teachers for asking questions. His harsh reaction wasn't about his students at all. It was his shadow trying to protect him from feeling that old shame. The second tool is what Jung called dream journaling. Now, before you roll your eyes at this one, hear me out. Jung discovered that our dreams often show us exactly what we're refusing to see when we're awake. He wasn't talking about mystical dream interpretation. He was talking about paying attention to the patterns in your own mind. Take Maria, another of Jung's patients. She kept having dreams about being chased by a wild woman with messy hair who screamed and broke things. In her waking life, Maria was proud of being ladylike and never losing her cool. But these dreams were showing her something important, her suppressed ability to stand up for herself and express strong emotions. Once she started acknowledging these qualities, the dreams changed. The wild woman became an ally rather than a threat, but you don't need to remember your dreams to do shadow work. Jung's third tool was what he called the judgment mirror. It works like this. Whenever you find yourself judging someone harshly, write down exactly what bothers you about them. Then, and this is the crucial part, ask yourself, have I ever done something similar, even in a small way? Or do I secretly wish I could? One of Jung's most successful clients was a man who constantly complained about attention seekers on social media. Through the judgment mirror exercise, he realized something surprising. He actually wanted more attention for his own work, but was too afraid to put himself out there. His judgment of others was really about his own suppressed desires. The fourth tool is probably the hardest but most powerful: voluntary discomfort. Jung noticed that people tend to create very comfortable routines that help them avoid their shadow. If you're afraid of conflict, you might always agree with others. If you're afraid of failure, you might only do things you know you'll succeed at. Breaking these patterns deliberately can help you meet your shadow. Jung worked with an executive who prided himself on always being right. As an exercise, Jung had him practice saying, "I don't know," at least once in every meeting. It was incredibly uncomfortable at first, but it led to a breakthrough. Not only did his team start contributing more ideas, but he finally acknowledged his deep fear of appearing incompetent, a fear that had been driving his behavior for years. The fifth tool is what Jung called active imagination. This isn't about daydreaming. It's about deliberately engaging with the parts of yourself you usually ignore. He would have patients imagine having a conversation with the parts of themselves they rejected. What would your anger say if it could talk? What about your fear, your ambition? A writer Jung worked with used this technique to overcome writer's block. She imagined having a conversation with her inner critic, that voice that told her everything she wrote was terrible. Instead of trying to silence this voice, she asked it what it was trying to protect her from. The answer surprised her. It was trying to protect her from the responsibility that would come with success. Once she understood this, she could work with her fear rather than against it. But here's something crucial Jung discovered. Shadow work isn't something you do once and finish. It's more like gardening. You need to keep tending to it. The goal isn't to fix your shadow or make it disappear. The goal is to develop a working relationship with it. Think about it like learning to drive. At first, you have to consciously think about every move you make, but eventually it becomes natural. You develop a relationship with the car. Shadow work is similar. At first, you need to consciously practice these tools, but over time, working with your shadow becomes more natural. One of Jung's long-term patients described it beautifully. She said that at first, her shadow felt like a monster in the basement of her mind, but as she worked with it, it became more like a guard dog, still powerful, still potentially dangerous, but now protecting her instead of threatening her. This leads us to one of Jung's most important insights. The goal of shadow work isn't to become perfect, it's to become whole. Perfect people don't exist. They're just people who are very good at hiding their shadow. But whole people, they exist. They're the ones who have learned to work with all parts of themselves, even the parts they once rejected. Remember the businessman who started painting? Years later, he told Jung that learning to accept his artistic side hadn't made him leave business. It had made him better at it. By becoming whole, he became more effective in every area of his life. As we wrap up this exploration of shadow work, ask yourself, what parts of yourself are you ready to reclaim? What qualities have you been pushing away that might actually help you if you learn to work with them? Remember, your shadow isn't your enemy. It's just waiting to be understood. So here's the truth about your mind and its lies. They're not really lies at all. They're more like an overprotective parent trying to keep you safe in the only way it knows how. Your mind isn't lying to you because it's malicious. It's trying to protect you from truths you might not be ready to face. But as Jung discovered, running from these truths costs us more than facing them ever could. Think about all the energy it takes to maintain an image of being perfectly good, perfectly rational, or perfectly anything. It's like trying to hold multiple beach balls underwater at once. Eventually, your arms get tired. Eventually, something has to give. This is why people who try to be perfect often end up having spectacular breakdowns, while people who acknowledge their shadows tend to be more stable and genuine. Jung saw this pattern play out hundreds of times in his practice. The priest who tried to be perfectly selfless ended up becoming genuinely caring once he acknowledged his own needs. The businessman who faced his creative shadow became more innovative in his work. The nice woman who accepted her anger became truly kind rather than merely compliant. They all discovered the same truth. Accepting your shadow doesn't make you worse, it makes you real. But here's something Jung noticed that's especially relevant today. We're living in a time when it's harder than ever to face our shadows. Social media encourages us to present perfect versions of ourselves. We can block or unfriend people who trigger our shadow material. We can surround ourselves with others who share our same blind spots. In many ways, it's never been easier to avoid our shadows. And yet, the cost of this avoidance has never been higher. Jung warned that the more we collectively deny our shadows, the more likely we are to project them onto others. He saw this play out in the conflicts of his time, and we can see it playing out today. When we can't admit our own capacity for being wrong, we become certain that others are always wrong. When we can't face our own darkness, we become obsessed with the darkness in others. One of Jung's last patients told a story that perfectly captures this. She was a social activist who prided herself on fighting for justice, but she noticed she was becoming increasingly angry and bitter, seeing enemies everywhere. Through shadow work, she realized something profound. By denying her own capacity for prejudice and unfairness, she had become exactly what she was fighting against, someone who judged others without mercy. This brings us to the ultimate paradox Jung discovered. The more we accept the parts of ourselves we'd rather not see, the less power they have over us. When we stop running from our shadow, we can finally choose how to act rather than being driven by unconscious forces. We become less reactive, more authentic, and, surprisingly, more capable of real goodness rather than performed perfection. Remember the executive who learned to say, "I don't know." A year after working with Jung, he reported something fascinating. Not only had his team become more innovative, but his whole relationship with knowledge had changed. Instead of using his expertise as a shield, he had become genuinely curious. By accepting his shadow of not knowing, he had gained real wisdom. This is the gift that shadow work offers us, the chance to become whole rather than perfect, to be real rather than right, to be authentic rather than admired. It's not an easy path. Jung was very clear about that. It requires courage to look at the parts of ourselves we've been taught to reject. It requires humility to admit that we contain everything we judge in others. It requires wisdom to see that our shadows, properly understood, can become sources of strength rather than shame. But the alternative? Continuing to let our unconscious shadows run our lives while we pretend to be in control. That's the real lie. That's the real danger. As Jung said, until we make the unconscious conscious, it will direct our lives and we will call it fate. So here's your invitation. The next time you feel a strong emotional reaction to someone, pause. The next time you find yourself judging harshly, pause. The next time you notice yourself trying to be perfect, pause. In that pause lies the beginning of shadow work. In that pause lies the potential for real change. Your shadow is waiting to be known, not to destroy you, but to complete you. Not to expose you as bad, but to help you become whole. The question isn't whether you have a shadow. We all do. The question is, are you ready to meet yours? Jung's greatest discovery wasn't just that our minds sometimes lie to us. It was that these lies, properly understood, can lead us to deeper truths about ourselves. Your shadow isn't your enemy. It's the key to becoming who you truly are. The only question is, are you ready to turn that key?